Welcome to Hudson Institute. Our subject today is China's strategy in the Global South. My name is Patrick Cronin. I'm Asia-Pacific Security Chair here at Hudson, and it is a great privilege to help launch another very meticulously researched and timely report by Dr. John Lee. John is a senior fellow here at Hudson, but he's also many other things, including a former national security advisor to the Australian Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, one of the really good ones, I should add, and also one of the foremost experts on Chinese political economy, especially as it relates to the Indo-Pacific region. So it's a real pleasure to help launch his new report, Understanding and Countering China's Global South Strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And it's available outside in hard copy. It's available for free downloading on our website, hudson.org. Now, joining this panel are two other distinguished Hudson scholars, Dr. Aparna Pande, who is, among other things, the director of the Future of India and South Asia here at Hudson. She's the author of a number of notable books, including one I use in my class up at Carnegie Mellon University, Making India Great, The Promise of a Reluctant Global Power. And Thomas Duesterberg. Dr. Duesterberg is a renowned expert on global trade, manufacturing, economics, and foreign policy. And his advice, I can assure you, is sought globally by leaders in government and industry around the world. So let's start first by turning to Dr. John Lee, to John, and ask him to highlight a few of the themes out of his excellent report. And after that, I'll turn to Aparna and Tom for some of their immediate reactions and reflections. And then we'll have a conversation and take a few questions as well from the audience before we're all done here today. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Aparna and Tom, for joining me on this panel as well, and of course all of you for giving up a beautiful day to be in this room. First, just a reason why I produced this report, and I want to acknowledge the Smith-Richardson Foundation who supported the research into this report. The United States, as you may know, is selling a vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. This vision, it sounds good. It's based on principles such as states having equal rights, equal privileges, states and entities and individuals operating under the rule of law, commerce based on merit and on fair competition. Now, the FOIP, as it's called, it's attractive to many fully industrialized advanced economies and democracies such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, and New Zealand, but it has, you would have to say, underwhelming support, and it's not championed by many developing economies in the Indo-Pacific, which obviously includes China. China's both developing and developed, but it's just not something that's championed amongst what you might call the Global South, the group of developing economies. Now, the difference in interests and values between the advanced and developing economies, it was illustrated in a different context by the reactions to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, for example, when the UN General Assembly held a vote in March 2022 condemning the Russian invasion and demanding the full withdrawal of Russian forces, 141 voted for the resolution, 5 against, and there were 35 abstentions. And North Korea and Russia voted against the resolution, but many Indo-Pacific Global South nations abstained. Back then, this was seen as a sign that much of the world, including in the Indo-Pacific, was turning against what the former Prime Minister from my country, Scott Morrison, called it was turning, or it was joining into an arc of revisionist powers seeking to threaten the regional global order, that is China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Now, since then, advanced liberal democracies have continued to criticize Russia, but there has not been much criticism from the Global South of Russia, or for that matter, for North Korea's and Iran's nuclear programs. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that there is a real divergence in the advocacy and the positioning between the advanced democracies and the developing countries. China is putting a lot of effort into emerging as the leader of the global south in a way that is directly against the interests and values of the United States. So while you've seen a hardening of attitudes and policies on the main towards China in North America, in Europe, amongst the advanced democracies in Asia like Japan and South Korea, that is just not true of many developing economies, including in the Indo-Pacific. These developing nations, they tend to underplay or outright dismiss American criticisms of Chinese political, trade, and military policies. Many in the Global South argue that the institutional, the normative, and the economic rules are biased and designed to entrench the interests of the United States and its advanced economy allies. Institutionally, they argue that Global South nations are underrepresented in institutions such as the United Nations Security Council, the World Bank, and the IMF. For Global South nations, where rapid development rather than a rules-based order is the highest priority for its ruling elites, the American-backed rules-based order is frequently seen as unhelpful. For example, American dissatisfaction with Chinese subsidies for Chinese firms is dismissed as being protective of the entrenched dominance of American and Western firms. And in fact, Global South nations are often happy to benefit from cheaper Chinese products, even though those Chinese products have been heavily subsidized, and in some cases, the IP stolen or transferred from Western companies. American demands for high standards are seen to be favouring established firms from advanced economies and raising prices for developing economies. Now, more broadly, the structure of American trade agreements is more beneficial for advanced economy partners than they are for Global South economies. So in contrast, China can offer at least a promise of guaranteed and immediate benefits for developing economies without any American or Western style assessments or merit or standards of accountability. For elites in developing countries, their short-term or personal interests are often more aligned with China's approach than they are with America and others. So if you think of a ruling elite or a ruling regime in a developing country, China tells them that they can achieve economic development without having to change the way they govern, without even having to change the economic structures. And that is a very attractive proposition to a lot of elites in a global south. So China promotes concepts such as the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. I won't go into these, but these initiatives offer the possibility that you as a political elite in a developing economy, that you can achieve your material goals without really changing much of what you're doing. So what can we do about this? I'll just suggest a couple of things. There's more suggestions in the report, but just a couple of key things. The first thing is that narratives matter because narratives shape the way we think about an issue or a problem. And China has been very successful at spreading the narrative within the developing world of this concept of authoritarian competence. That is, an authoritarian regime and structure is going to be more competent and effective, particularly at economic development and stewardship, than any kind of democratic system. So that's been a very strong narrative. China, as we know, faces enormous developmental and economic problems, something my colleague Tom has written about recently very persuasively and with great depth. But this is not the kind of conversation that developing countries have. They still see China as a very successful political economy, and I think this needs to be something that's openly addressed. Second, China uses both clever narratives and also material offerings to achieve elite capture in developing economies. That is, aligning the personal and political interests of elites with those interests of China, and then China using this leverage over these elites to achieve its economic and strategic aims. Now, we need to play this political game. I'm not at all suggesting that we do what China does, much of which is illegal or certainly corrupt. But we must accept that we're in a contest to influence elites in various countries. Now, some elites want the best outcomes for their populations, and we can use various policies to enable them. To be blunt, some elites are self-serving, incompetent, or corrupt. We can expose them, or at the very least, follow the do no harm principle by not enabling these kinds of elites. And there are ways we can do that. We can use aid, which is a powerful tool the United States and other countries like Japan and Australia have to support the kind of projects that maximize, in a legitimate way, our influence with elites. Another suggestion, we need to increase economic options for developing nations that are willing to align with us in strategic terms. Such nations should be offered economic opportunity if their strategic alignment is something that is following the same direction and trends of the United States. Often we will go to a country, not just the United States, but Australia as well. We will have that strategic conversation. There will be a lot of strategic interest, but there's rarely an economic element attached to that. And regardless of the strategic interests of elites in developing countries, they do need economic and material opportunities as well. I think the US and allies need to offer incentives and direct investment into economies willing to disentangle, at least diversify their supply chains in key sectors, not everywhere, but in key sectors away from China. Countries that are willing to agree on common rules and standards and export controls for key sectors. We need to link market access to adherence to legal, regulatory, and human rights rules and standards with the US. And we need to support institutions that can better resist predatory Chinese practices and even impose punishments or costs on China for these sorts of practices. So I've just given a broad outline of the report, and I'll now pass on to my colleagues.
Well, John, thank you very much. You have indeed just touched the surface of your really, really excellent report. I mean, John's brought sort of an understanding of the politics of the region, the economics of the region and globally, how they're trending, and then he's sort of put on top of that a strategy, and he sort of just outlined some of those strategic steps. So I really encourage you to read the 70-page report and the footnotes and the details. But let me turn first to Aparna and then Tom to get their kind of reactions.
Thanks. First of all, congrats to John on an excellent report, and great to be on a panel with Patrick and Tom. I'll quickly touch on how the report looks at the Global South and then the India factor. John's report actually provides detailed information on why and how China has actually been able to appeal to the Global South. I could put in almost every country, any country in the Global South, including India, into every one of the sentences you said, and it would apply. Because many of these countries, like during the Cold War, believe, and I'll quote from the report, that they lack any structural or unilateral agency to influence outcomes in the US-China context, end quote. Many of these countries also do not see any existential threat from a potential China-led order, and therefore don't want to, and I'll again quote, be forced to choose sides. Many of these countries believe their best option is to extract the best they can from both sides in this competition. John pointed out, sort of the fact that there's not just elite capture, but that elites in many of these countries believe they can get more from China than from the United States and its allies, whether it's economic investment, aid, and of course, support for their very survival, because China has deeper pockets, or is at least willing to, sort of use the deep pockets it has, and China does not care about the regime type, as long as the regime is supportive. And for many of the countries in the Global South, economic benefits that arise from close ties with China are critical to their own very survival and their domestic political economic well-being. And finally, they fear disruption from any US-China peer competition and rivalry or great power competition that it will actually cause greater damage to their economic well-being and their political well-being than choosing a side. So they don't want to choose sides because that will cause too much of damage to to their very survival. Turning to India, John's report actually has a detailed segment on India, and I'd agree with almost everything I'll say. Can't agree with everything you say on India and the Global South. At the G20 summit that India hosted last September, India voiced its intention to be a leader and voice for the Global South. It is the world's most populous country. It is one of the fastest growing economies. And in many ways, India has long believed that it reflects the interests of the industrialized, of the developing global South, or we can call it the former non-aligned world. India believed it was a leader of the non-aligned world in the Cold War, and it's simply taking or continuing that role in this particular time. In the past 1.5 years, India has hosted 2 Global South summits with over 100 countries participating, albeit virtually. At several other summits last year, the G20, the BRICS grouping, which is Brazil, India, China, Russia, plus 5 others, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, both of which include Russia and China. India declared it as its priorities, issues which John mentions in his report, but which matter to the developing world: humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, climate change, health, education, training, science technology, capacity building, infrastructure, economic investment, economic development. Most of the countries in the Global South, including India, prefer a multipolar world order. India's hope is it's one of those poles in that multipolar world order, but they do not want a bipolar world order or a great power competition returning to this world. And they don't want to have to choose sides based on one or the other superpower's preferences. And here I'll quote India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar. In his book, he wrote, and I quote, "To engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies of support." That is what India seeks to do. And I'm sure most other countries of the Global South would, by and large, agree with this particular sentence. The challenge India faces, and it comes out in John's report, is China isn't going to easily let India be a leader of the Global South, however much India may want to be that. Beijing will throw a wrench into these plans. It already has, because China has deeper pockets. Its economic largest is more than India, not just in the broader Global South, but in India's own neighborhood, where China is actually the trading partner of every country, including India, the largest trading partner. So India faces this uphill battle. The key argument in John's report, with which I agree, is that the US cannot recruit India as a partner to counter China. And the US should also avoid creating a perception that India and the US are, and I'll quote from John's report, working hand in glove on strategic, economic, or normative issues, because this will hurt India's decades-old standing within this grouping. Instead, the US, and this is where I will differ slightly with John, that the US and allies should support India's efforts to enjoy a greater influence in the Global South. India has diplomatic leverage, decades-old developmental assistance. It has soft power. It is not viewed as a threat by most countries in the Global South. It's also a potential bridge between the developed and the developing world. And so it is not a security ally of the United States or of any other country. And so it is easier for countries to to see India as a country they would like a better relationship with, and in some ways, a country which was a former non-aligned country, which is now a close partner of the United States, putting forward a point of view with which the US agrees. It's much easier for that to happen vis-a-vis India than it would through any of the other American allies who are by default bracketed in the same group as the United States is. And so it would be in some ways a prudent nod to diplomatic realism. When countries don't want to choose a side, maybe allow a country which is viewed as sort of in between to put forth a vision for a free, open, and inclusive liberal order. I'll stop there. Look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Aparna. Very thoughtful, and it reminds me, of course, that it's not just US-China vying for competition in the Global South. You've got India, you have Indonesia, we'll come back to that maybe, and other countries that are also looking to elevate their position in the Global South. But let's turn first to Dr. Duesterberg. Tom, over to you.
Okay, I'd like to, in the hopes that this is not too overstated, but I really always learn a lot from John's papers, and there is a considerable amount of nuance in the way John presents things, which I find useful, especially when we think about China-US differences. They're black and white, or they're usually perceived as pretty black and white, whereas there are all kinds of degrees of nuance in between. Just a few examples that I picked out that I thought were worth emphasizing. He makes the case for the importance of what he calls Chineseness, and really Xi Jinping and the PRC, who have started to use that term, which has a very rich meaning. It could be perceived as being purely sort of xenophobic or even racist in certain cases. But what is in John's telling, what they are trying to do is reinforce the concept of inevitability of the magnetic force of China that Asians can't avoid. I mean, it's almost harking back to the times of the Middle Kingdom and the tribute systems, and in a psychological sort of way. John also makes the point that China doesn't always need to totally win over the global South. It just needs to achieve neutrality. We in the United States tend to put these things in a dichotomous way as well, which is probably not the way to think about it, and Aparna touched on that. What China, part of the narrative, a large part of the narrative, is not necessarily the Chinese way of doing things, but John draws the distinction between what we have come accustomed to using as a sort of the global term for the way we think about organizing the world as a rules-based system, whereas most countries, including and China, has realized that in a way we haven't, are just looking for some advantage to both sides, not necessarily wanting to take sides. And in a rules-based system, it's a little bit inflexible. I like John's sort of summary of these sorts of things, and as he says toward the end, contrasting American narratives versus Chinese narratives. While the United States promotes abstract principles such as rules-based order, international law, or the free and open Indo-Pacific, China is speaking the language of development, material advancement, and support to smaller countries to choose their own political and economic pathways, while the U.S. attempts to articulate and explain the contours of the emerging comprehensive competition and rivalry with China. The latter is putting forth initiatives to enhance the common development and security in the region. So all in all, I find the conceptual framework that John has laid out is both nuanced and fairly convincing. Now, I have a few questions. about how this is going to unfold in the future and what the success of the Chinese will be. And Patrick mentioned I've done a little bit of work on the strength of the Chinese economy, and I'm on the side that is thinking that the Chinese economy is evolved in a way that is not as sustainable as anyone would like. The beanstalk's not going to grow to the sky, but even more than that, that there are a bunch of vulnerabilities that have developed in the system. And I wonder, in a general sort of way, if there isn't a growing recognition that there are, that the Chinese way, authoritarian, whatever one might call it, the Chinese make the argument that it's just more effective economically and politically for the global South. Now, many of the countries in the global South have already experienced working with the Chinese through the Belt and Road Initiative. And the fact of the matter, I think, is that the Belt and Road is starting to lose its ability to project a really positive image, not only within China. A lot of the projects that they've developed are basically losing money, and second, the local economies don't always necessarily benefit from the largesse, as John calls it, of the Chinese. There are, and you know, at a macro narrative level, if you will, this idea that the Chinese economy is inevitably going to keep growing, and it has this sort of magnetic power because of its size and because of its ability to grow the way it has the last 30 or 40 years. But many indicators in China are weakening. I mean, let's start with the stock market, which is at the lowest level it has been for 4 years. Some $6 trillion or so in capital has disappeared. The housing market, which is the store of wealth, major source of storing wealth in China, and has been for the last 20, 30, 40 years, has cratered. It keeps going down. People are losing money on that. People are going to college, but they're not getting jobs. Youth unemployment is high. We think it's about 20%. But all of these things are negative indicators for this narrative. How much people in both the developing world and the developed world recognize that remains to be seen, partly because the U.S. and its allies have not been very good in countering the narrative of China, the grand narrative, and haven't even, for a large part, even tried. And finally, I wonder, from China's perspective, if reliance for growth in the future and prosperity in the future that relies on the global South is actually going to work. I mean, everything that China is doing to try to create dominance in at least from an economic point of view, it tends to have a negative impact. I mean, we're feeling this in the United States. You're starting to see some pushback. But if you just do the numbers about the size of the global South plus China, or the BRICS for that matter, compare that with the size and the dynamism of the developed world and even a subset of U.S. and its allies, the U.S., EU, Japan, Korea, Australia, a few others, it's much more dynamic. And Xi Jinping has hitched his horse now to the Soviet Union, Russia, which is weak economically, amongst other things, but that alliance is adding to the tension created by the economic powers, the economic policies of China. So my question is in a general way, and I'd like this to be a dialogue because I don't know the answer, but can the Chinese grand narrative model stand up in terms of public opinion? You know, Pew and some others do surveys of attitudes towards China, which have been tending, if I read them right, to becoming more negative in the last few years. So I'm sorry I've talked too long, but hope we can use that as a stimulus to dialogue.
It's a great stimulus, Tom. Obviously, you're not persuaded by this undeterrable, superior Chinese inevitable model, but you're not alone, actually. But let's put that in the context of really two sets of questions that I want to ask, because your reports, John, is sort of challenge and response. So let's start with what the Chinese are up to, including the evaluation of how well they're likely to do or how they're perceived doing. And then we'll go maybe to the responses and what are we offering, what are we delivering, collectively. When I think about the earlier this month, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, significant pageantry in Beijing, but also money. I mean, for the first time since 2016, this sort of slowing economy and Belt and Road Initiative that Tom alluded to, kind of fading after the 10th anniversary. Suddenly, they're adding some more money to Africa, at least maybe $10 billion a year on average over the next few years, which is not the $1 trillion that they like to advertise, but it's real money in a place that really needs real development. And meanwhile, in your neck of the woods, in the Pacific Islands, they just had a bit of a sort of a contretemps over policing. And the Chinese lost that initiative. They lost that. So they actually lost some face there. They gained maybe some notoriety in African leaders and lost a little bit in the Pacific Islands. What is Xi Jinping doing now? Is he sort of going beyond the Belt and Road to try to cast this now as Global South and go back to these three worlds that you talk about, sort of Mao, back to Mao? And is he succeeding, really? Or is it just, this is too big a playing field? He's competing with India, he's competing with at home in China, well before he's competing with the United States. So how do you read that, including whether his narrative can win? Sorry.
I mean, the way I read it is that if you look at the Belt and Road initially as it was introduced by Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road, yes, covers a lot of the Global South from Indo-Pacific to Africa and so on. But key to the Belt and Road, in my view, Belt and Road was about supply chains that were centered on China, but it relied on the cooperation of Europe to succeed. And that's not going to happen in a way that I think the Chinese would like. I'm not saying therefore the Belt and Road scrap. The point I'm making is that I think it's occurred to many Chinese thinkers and Xi Jinping that both the structural and the normative interest between China on one hand and developing economies on the other is now far more powerful. And he's also realised the converse of that is the interest and the values of a lot of developing countries compared to the United States and the developed world is diverging. So I think he's seen that. I think he sees an advantage in that. And if you look at the way he talks to Africa, the way he talks to the South Pacific, the way he talks to Southeast Asia, the developing countries in those sub-regions, it's not just about material largesse. He talks to them about creating a fairer order, a fairer system, a world where these sub-regions will rise up and feel the pride of rising up. I mean, that's a completely different way of approaching international relations to the American and the Western way. And I think it's been very effective, this combination of material largesse and targeting the aspirations of the suppressed and the underdog, as it were. It has been very, very effective. Very quickly, on a narrative, look, I think there's lots for us to work on when it comes to authoritarian competence, the narrative of that. But the problem is that a lot of regimes in the Global South don't care. They are authoritarian governments, or they are some of them are corrupt and incompetent elites who just want an immediate gain. And so, even if the narrative of China is challenged successfully, for a lot of these elites and governments, they don't care so much because they're getting from China in the short term without actually having to change the way they govern, right? And where else can they actually get that? So I'm more confident about being able to challenge the narrative in a sense, but I'm less confident about what to do with what I call elite capture.
Aparna, indeed, I'm coming back to you, but before you answer that, I mean, let me just throw on top of that for you to help us think through how Indian strategic thinkers, if I can use that broad phrase, might be back in New Delhi thinking about the degree to which Indian interests converge with China in the global south because they also want to change the rules and they also definitely want development. Or is this part of the strategic competition as well for India's leadership in the global south? Will we see, in Brazil, in a few weeks' time, some competition between India and China and others vying for leadership in this? But and anything else you wanted to add, and then we're going to go back to Tom.
One comment on what John said. I mean, sort of for narrative building, I would say, some parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia, there are examples. Pakistan, CPEC, which is the flagship, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, supposed to be 65 billion. Chinese have only invested 32 billion. And Pakistan's debt has worsened. 1/4 of it is owed to China, and Pakistan is having bigger problems. So CPEC hasn't really worked. So BRI's flagship project in the region hasn't worked. Sri Lanka and the Hambantota port, sort of Pakistan's Gwadar is gone, Hambantota, Maldives, and the debt that it owes China, Cambodia. So there are countries in South and Southeast Asia which are part of BRI whose debt and whose challenges have worsened. Economic problems have worsened after becoming part of BRI. And maybe there, I mean, you don't need any other, you don't need to even cite China, just cite these examples and the problems that these countries are facing after becoming part of BRI to use as an example to counter China's BRI narrative. Coming to your question, Patrick, there is a competition between India and China. It goes back to the 1950s, as you know very well. It's there's a competition for whose backyard is the Indian Ocean. India believes the Indian Ocean is India's backyard. Historically, civilizationally, China believes it is part of China's backyard. So that strategic competition started off in the 50s and continues to this day. Yes, there's a back and forth. India's economy and sort of the GDP size, China is, I think, 5 to 7 times India's, and similarly on the military potential. But and so India for India, this is India's neighborhood. It is critical to India's national security and economic interests. So India's desire to be a leader of the global south and push back against the global south is partly to counter China's presence in its own region. China has deeper presence in South Asia than India has in Middle East and Southeast Asia or the Pacific Islands. And so India has in the last decade, improved, increased its developmental assistance. We are talking about the Pacific Islands. India has an annual Pacific Islands Forum where India gives economic and developmental assistance. India has close economic, relations and security with Southeast Asia. India has a very deep economic and security partnership with Middle East. For India, the Indo-Pacific actually starts from the Western Indian Ocean and continues all the way to the Pacific. Unlike the United States, India includes part of Central Command also in it. And so, so for India, it is a strategic, but it's also a very, it's a security and economic dimension to it. If India does not push back against China, India will face challenges, within its own backyard. Coming to, G20, BRICS, SCO, for India, these organizations have served two purposes. One, India believes as one of the poles in this multipolar world order, it needs to be represented on every institution, whether it's regional or global. So John had mentioned in his remarks that Global South countries believe they need to be on the UN Security Council. They need to have better leverage on World Bank and IMF. But the second part is it needs to counter the Chinese narrative in all of these regional organizations. If India is not there, then it's the Chinese narrative which will prevail. I'll stop there.
Excellent. And Tom, if I could come back to you and try to put this in the context of things you know so well in terms of the global trading system and the fact that the World Trade Organization is faltering. where manufacturing is moving in terms of the supply chain. Will developing countries be the new manufacturing centers? We know what India is trying to do, and of course there are reports that India is having to do it with Chinese components, right? I mean, at least for the time being. So before we even get to what we might be able to offer with allies and partners in terms of engaging parts of the developing world, especially in the Indo-Pacific, how do you think China's trying to maneuver under Xi Jinping this economic downturn or slowing economy right now? I wouldn't call it peak China yet. I wouldn't agree with Mike Beckley on that. I think the court, we don't know yet where it's going, but clearly they have lots of challenges. So put together, if you will, for us, just in your initial thoughts, the global economy and China's economy, and what are China's options right now? How do you read China's economic policy right now with Xi Jinping in terms of the Global South Plus? I mean, what is he up to here? Can he really succeed with this engagement? They don't have the money to just keep pouring it into the developing world. So they're being more strategic. They're trying to target it more. That's why they've gone more digitally and sort of lower project levels. But narratives only go so far. I mean, narratives in the developing world, my experience at USAID was they'll take the money, come back next year and they'll forget that you gave them the money last year because they want to know what you're doing for them right now. So as long as China's providing things for developing countries are going to listen, provided it comes at an acceptable price. But how do you see the Chinese economic strategy in all of this in terms of where this global economy is heading with the Global South? If that's not too broad a question.
Okay, well, let me give it a shot.
Okay.
My view of the ultimate goals of China are maybe a little different than John's more nuanced version.
Yes.
But just to put it bluntly, I think what they would like to achieve is independence, pretty much total economic and political independence of the Western system, the United States, and the economies associated with that. And so some of these institutions that Aparna mentioned, the BRI, the Shanghai Cooperation Council, and so on and so forth, are part and parcel of their attempt to create a new order. And whether or not the Bretton Woods type order survives is an open question. But China's ultimate goal, I think, is, I think, decoupling. And I think that's it's partly tied to the economic choices that China has now. And again, to oversimplify, they have made a choice that Mao Zedong made back in the 1950s, which is that industrial power is the entire key to global power, and they're going to pursue that at all costs. And what that means now in the current circumstances is they've doubled down on investment in manufacturing of one sort or another, old tech and new tech. And that's, so they are in a dilemma because in order to offload and the overcapacity that they had, they're still dependent on the West, writ large. And that competes with the Global South, frankly, which their road to growth in the future and development in the future is in large part still dependent too on diversifying the global economy outside of the United States and outside of China for that matter. But again, I think China has made that choice. And I don't see them changing anytime soon without some major political developments inside China, which we can only loosely speculate about.
This is why Tom's such a good analyst, because he appreciates the nuance, but he's willing to make a judgment and be blunt, which is what you need from expertise. You need them sometimes to just make a judgment call. And I just want to come back to that, John, because we've been grappling, collectively with this idea. What is China up to? Are they trying to reform the system and just be a bigger part of it? They're just, peaceful rise, or are they trying to displace us, replace us? Is it anti-American? And when you go back to Sydney and Canberra, shortly, back home, how do they see that issue? In addition to your nuance, are they as nuanced or even?
Look, Tom's not incorrect at all. I mean, if you asked me, okay, what is my bottom line in terms of economic strategy in the global south, I would say China wants inputs not from the West, and it wants markets that are not the West. And then you can extend that to as well, being in a financial ecosystem that isn't controlled, particularly by the United States. So, and it can get a lot of that from the global south. Not right now, not everything, as Tom mentioned, but that's what it's trying to do. It wants guaranteed inputs and guaranteed markets, and a lot of that will be in the global south. On the sort of geopolitical side of things, what does it want? My assumption is that it wants a global. It doesn't think necessarily in terms of it wants the whole world to be a Chinese order, but it wants a global system, even if it's not actually in order, that's sympathetic to the way China does things. And what I mean by this is sympathetic to the way the Chinese political economy is structured, sympathetic to the way China does commerce, sympathetic to the way China uses coercion, for example, in different contexts to achieve its interests. It doesn't want this very tightly defined rules-based order that the United States keeps on talking about. So, and once again, that kind of vision, the global south countries don't have to necessarily buy completely into it. They just have to be participants in it and to some extent enablers of it. That's all China needs to do, and that would be a huge, that would create an enormous issue, I think, for the United States if the global south, which is most of the countries in the world, are actually indifferent to the sorts of things that I just said that the Chinese want to advance and achieve.
And Tom, just going back to you, is that incompatible with U.S. security? And Aparna, I'm going to ask you as well whether you think from an Indian perspective, for instance, how would India view this kind of return to a tributary system, if you will, kind of a looser hegemony that's friendlier and less coercive, less directly, overtly coercive as a Western system that they're talking about. But Tom, is this incompatible? Is this a zero-sum game? And to what extent can we avoid that? I mean, is there a way around that if it is?
I'm not. I'm a little bit pessimistic right now that China is going to change.
Yes.
And it is inimical to the interests of the United States, both politically and economically. What John points out, I think, pretty well, is that we not only have a lack of competing, coherent national narrative that makes sense in the 21st century. We're still talking about a global rules-based system, and that India doesn't want that, the global south doesn't want that writ large, the Chinese don't want that. We have to retool, but we also have to do a better job of offering something that is both at a institutional level more compatible with the broad interests of more nations, but also we have to compete with China in terms of offering something
right.
to the global south, and we're not doing that.
And let me press you on that one issue. So let's talk about extractive industries. I mean, China's pouring money into Africa and into Indonesia and Southeast Asia because it wants resources to fuel its great industrial power. Why couldn't we collectively, again, US aid and other allies and partners, work to create manufacturing capability, not just in India, but in other global south countries, developing countries, so that they can benefit from their own resources? And, so we're actually going one step beyond what the Chinese are offering. Now, I don't know, is that possible, or is that too much structurally at conflict with what we're doing?
Sure, it's possible. And the G7, 2 years ago,
exactly.
put in $1 trillion, or rhetorically agreed to $1 trillion to help out with infrastructure. But unfortunately, the political moment here in the United States is not going in that direction. We're going in a more inward direction, and we have to turn that around, I think, in order to politically justify putting the resources into extractive industries around the world that are mutually beneficial, we have to rethink why we reneged or pulled out of the TPP and the CPTPP. We're not doing anything that really
There's no multilateral trade that we're engaged in right now. The Trans-Pacific Partnership and the comprehensive progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership is something that others are moving ahead on. China's even trying to get joined, but we're
and it doesn't have to be at the global level.
Right.
And it's impractical to think that it'll ever happen at a global level in the near term, but at a regional level or bilateral level. Like I think John points out, mostly bilateral.
I mean, I just on that very quickly, say Indonesia, a critical global south player in Indo-Pacific. I mean, I was informed that the last time the previous President Jokowi met President Biden wanted to talk about the rules-based order and security threats. Jokowi basically had a map of Indonesia and said, this is where we need investment. And that just brings out the stark difference in terms of what they want and what we're offering. Now, we could have spoken about security and then linked it to investment. And I think the same should be done for Philippines, for example, who is aligning closer to the United States strategically. Yes, it won't be the sort of global architecture that strategists love, but we do need to come up with country by country incentives and also create opportunity costs that if other countries don't move in this direction, they will miss out. At the moment, they're not missing out on anything, so they're not actually having to make decisions in ways that favor the United States.
I'm mindful that we're almost running out of time, and I haven't turned to this very patient, smart audience that we had before. So if there's anybody who wants to ask a question, if you want to raise your hand, there's a gentleman right here. Morgan will come up here with a microphone. If you would just briefly identify yourself and then ask a brief question. And then this gentleman over on the far aisle over here, second. So go ahead, yes. And maybe we'll ask both questions before we turn back to the panel.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am a recent graduate of BART, one of my professors, Walter Russell Mead. So I'm glad to be here. My question is, so we have talked about the Chinese side, with not enough of the US side. My question is how United States policies should bring priorities in a way that helps United States domestic economy, but also the foreign investment, but also the overall grand strategic goals. What would be from the US side, vision or grand strategic plans to accomplish that, not only countering China or whether it's narrative or whether it's strategic or non-strategic elements. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and the second question is going to be over here, gentlemen. And so the first question is going to be on obviously what are we offering, and I think there's both a defensive side of that and an offensive side of that. China aside, what are we offering? And then what things we have to be concerned about? No, we need actually to counter the narrative or counter corruption or counter things that lack transparency that could lead to really bad practices. Let's hear a second question first, and then we'll turn back to the panel. And the third question, the woman in front, and that'll be the only time for questions, but go ahead.
Kevin Shives with the National Endowment for Democracy, just upstairs, the International Forum for Democratic Studies. It was good to see, part of your report talking about the kind of leading into a values-based approach to these issues, which I think really provides a much better advantage than one in which that might lean heavily on sort of security frames. So, for example, there's other places in your report too. I'm kind of curious about your reaction where you propose a very aggressive government-focused strategy of influence and information, delivery and the like. A lot of people have wanted to go back to the days of what that looked like in the 80s and so forth in the Cold War. And I'm kind of curious where that sits in terms of sort of the local agency and some of the voices of non-government voices, which we've seen in my institution be quite powerful in addressing in their own rights and in their own interests. ways in which China has sort of manipulated local laws, violated labor laws, things like that, the Belt and Road Initiative, but a whole range of other ways in which China has sort of undermined democratic values and practices around the world. So I guess the question really is, where does sort of like the non-government side sit in this, and when what you see in the Indo-Pacific, where do you see the role of civil society organizations and the like, being able to empower them, which really brings in a lot of this local agency rather than making this sort of a US-China fight just happen to be fought in another country, if you know what I mean. So.
Absolutely, and these are really broad issues, and that's why you're right to bring up the values issue. Obviously, there's going to be a tension between wanting to deal with developing countries on terms of no constraints whatsoever, which is what China's offering them, versus coming in with our values-based, and that complicates further what we're trying to do, even though it's very, very important. So how do we do it? How do we work with civil society? But let's get this third question right here, and then we'll turn to the panel for a final round, and we'll call it a day. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Grace Yang from Free University of Berlin in Germany. I'm traveling here, and I've been thinking about a question for a long time. Is the rivalry between China and the United States inevitable, and why?
I'm sorry, what inevitable?
The rivalry between China and the United States, or China and the West.
Well, I don't know if it's inevitable, but it's here. But let's turn to the panel for final answers, and we can go in any order on this. John, we want to give you the last word rather than the first word, and just go to Tom and Aparna, and then back to John.
Okay, I'll be very brief, but on what the U.S. can do better. Number one, we talked about a couple of things. I mean, helping out on infrastructure, offering other maybe better trade conditions. I think the advantage the United States has, or I hope that we've had in the past, is there is at least some mutual benefit in a lot of our aid, whereas with the Chinese, it tends to be pretty much one way. But another thing I would just emphasize is the United States needs to stop shooting itself in the foot. It is not helpful to put, for instance, tariffs on our allies. If we're going to have a functioning, at least regional trade system, we can't go putting arbitrary tariffs on. We can't shut out, investors like Nippon Steel, for instance. So that sort of thing is also important, I think, for us to present a better face to the world and to get the allies that we really need, because we are going to have competition with China.
Aparna, do you want to address all three of those points?
I'll address the question you asked earlier, and I think I've missed it. What India's reaction is to the growing U.S.-China, and if India has a preference for the world order. I'd say India's first preference is a multipolar world order, and a Chinese-led world order would be anathema. But after a multipolar, it'll prefer the unipolar movement, which is continued, because US-China bipolar world would force India to choose sides, and it would have to choose the American side because it cannot choose the Chinese side for just strategic reasons. And so, a multipolar or a seemingly multipolar is the preference for India, because China-Russia relations, South Asian region, which matters to India, means India would have to choose an American side in the US-China rivalry.
Indeed. It sounds like a reluctant great power to me, but so John, over to you to kind of sort of underscore again what you think U.S. can do with others. And then this question of values and how, I'm thinking of, so if there's a Harris administration, for instance, presumably values will be part and baked into a lot of the policy in terms of, whether it's labor, environment, gender, and that's going to only further complicate how we approach anybody in the world while we're trying to develop their interests. It doesn't mean it can't happen. You got to get all stakeholders at the table and try to make what's the art of the possible. But it does complicate it. But how do you think about what the U.S. can be doing, and this question of values in this competition?
Well, first of all, what the US can be doing, and I want to be realistic about the political situation here, that the days of lauding an open, liberal, free trade system are over, right? So we just have to work with that. But that's where I think the US can offer security partners special economic deals. I don't mean in a corrupt way, I just mean in an attractive way. So align economic incentives and opportunities with security or strategic alignment. And obvious countries would be the Philippines, for example. I mean, in practice, it's already being done with countries like Japan and Australia and Taiwan and South Korea. And the effect of that is, yes, some people say that will create an insiders versus outsiders club. But the point is you're trying to create opportunity costs for those countries that don't move in that direction. So the US is not coercing any country saying you must do this. But if you don't move in this direction, these are the opportunities you'll miss out on. But the first step, the US has to be prepared to offer opportunities. On a values issue, I maybe approach it from an Australian perspective. The US has a tendency to want to globalize everything and want to universalize everything. And what I mean is, the reality with the United States is that United States are the allies of the United States, or the closest allies are the ones with shared values, right? There is no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean you can have different kinds of relationships with those countries that are aligned in some ways but don't really share your values in a significant way. An obvious example would be Vietnam, right? I mean, Vietnam doesn't align with your political values, but there are very strong strategic interests. And there are a whole host of developing nations where their values won't align. The US just shouldn't hold up that high expectation of, let's try to create A-grade allies, and we don't do that, that's failure. I mean, no, that is too high a standard. There are all sorts of relationships you can have where values don't actually align.
Excellent. And I don't want to give short shrift to your question. It's a very important question, but it's an imponderable about this rivalry. We don't know where this US-China relationship will end up in 5, 10, 20 years. I would recommend books like Evan Medeiros, who wrote a very good edited volume of Chinese and American authors just published in the last couple of months called Cold Rivals. It's another book I assigned to my students at Carnegie Mellon University, including the Chinese written chapters in there, on this, how they look at this issue, because this is a problem. And you mentioned Berlin. Of course, the EU sees China as a systemic rival. So this is not just unique to the United States in China, or Australia in China, or India in China, although India is only doing its own thing. But let me bring this down to a close, unfortunately, because we are out of time. But if you haven't read Understanding and Countering China's Global South Strategy in the Indo-Pacific, I highly encourage you to do it. It's an easy read, and yet there's a lot of data in there to pore over and contemplate and to try to figure out where different countries are on different parts of the sort of equation. But John, a great piece of work. I'm so glad Smith Richardson funded your report here at Hudson, and that I've got great colleagues like you and Aparna and Tom to come here and reflect on these issues, which are nuanced, and yet we need bold judgments, and you do make some bold judgments in here too. So please congratulate John and this panel.